Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and hands-on learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. My name is Sylvan and I will be your host. Today we're in Zurich and talk to GetYourGuide co-founder Pascal Mathis. We have taken up your questions about early stage fundraising via Instagram and Facebook and are now putting this into our very first Q&A session. The result is a short and clear pointers that you can apply directly to your business. We hope you'll like this new format and make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram to submit your questions for the next Q&A sessions and also to decide on the topics that we cover next. Before we get started with the episode, I would like to introduce you to SBB Startup. If you think that your company is a good fit for the Swiss Railways, get in touch with them or learn more about their startup programs at sbbstartup.com. Pascal, well, welcome to the Swisspreneur Show. It's great to have you here today for our very first Q&A session. We talk about fundraising, especially for early stage startups and seed financing rounds. And we ask our community about their questions. And the first one that they asked is from Cedric Waldburger. And he asked, what are some questions that every founder should ask themselves before actually fundraising?
First, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Good question. That's always something we ask our founders in our portfolio as well. And the most important thing, I think, is the size of the round. How much money do I need? And how you find out how much money you need is by thinking about what next steps do you want to achieve with this money.
Do you have a good example for a good next step or milestone that you want to
I
achieve?
have an example of a not so good next step. This is developing the product. We don't like this as investors.
Why not?
So, because you want to invest in something which already is there and which works. So if they say that 80% of the money is going into the further development of the product, and then they will achieve product market fit, that's not so good for us. So we want to see every money, every dollar goes into the sales side. So selling this awesome product, that's better use of money.
But I can imagine this is also a bit a dilemma because the founders, they need some time and probably also some money to develop something. But at the same time, you also expect something that's already in the market and can generate some revenue as an investor. So
that's the tricky part. As a founder, you have to further develop the product with a little bit of the money, achieve a certain milestone so that the product is ready or ready for a certain group of customers, and then go out, gain some market traction. And with this market traction, that you go back to your investors and ask for more money. This is a little bit the not so easy circle or balance act. Another important factor I would look at is who should be your investor. So choose your investor wisely. About like apart from the money, what can your investor bring you in terms of network, know-how, etc. So don't underestimate this fact. So especially in Switzerland, there is a lot of money around, and most of founders find the money somewhere. But I would do a short list with the ideal people coming in as investors, and then really look for their network and their know-how.
In that regard, people often talk about smart money, but how do you actually determine what smart means for your business?
So what I always tell my companies is that they should just look at the next phase. A phase in our world is 2 years more or less. And for this phase, we think about like what crucial skill or network part do we miss? And this is how we then choose the investor.
Do you have an example for an early stage startup, how that could look like in practice?
Yeah, for instance, they want to sell to big corporates in a certain field. Right. Then it's very logical that you search for executives or ex-executives of these companies or salespeople who have done negotiations with these big companies, and then you go for these.
Yeah, sounds like a good plan.
Sounds very easy.
But hard to do in
theory,
practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next question concerns timing and is coming from Tim Michaelis. He sent it in through our website, and he asked, when is the ideal time to find investors beyond your friends, family, and fools in regards of being able to move forward quickly, but also not giving up too many shares? It's still a bit related to the first question, but I think in terms of timing, this is a really big time question coming from Swiss entrepreneurs.
Timing is extremely difficult, but crucial. So we always try to raise for 18 months, 1.5 years. And then it's all about these milestones. This is a little bit how I look at it. I always try to achieve a certain milestone, which makes it obvious that the company now has gained in valuation. That's always a good time then to go to the investors. Right. But it's really tough. It's never a good time to fundraise. You always think that, just to finish this next feature, get a little bit of more market traction, and then finally you're worth.
Then also another question that's coming from Jason Duran. He sent it in through Instagram. He asked, after how much revenue did you start seeking for investors? So, I think this is very case specific, I can imagine.
Absolutely. I can just tell you how we did it at GetYourGuide. So there we did a little bit of money we took from our parents, since we didn't have any, and some from family and fools. And then as soon as we had a little bit of revenue, we already started to look for external money. But since it was a B2C case, we needed a lot of money to promote it, to do marketing. Absolutely. As you mentioned, it's extremely dependent on the business case. So if you do software or if you do hardware, B2B, B2C makes a hell of a difference.
And also in terms of revenue, is there any amount that you say, hey, before you raise your first round, beyond the family, friends, and fools, is there any good revenue number that you say, okay, this range would be appropriate for going out and talking to investors?
Not really. It's always a mix between traction and if it's not revenue, then maybe you have a growing user base, right, things like that. But the people are psychological. So whenever you reach a new number of digits, so 500,000, it's not a new number, but 1 million, right, 10 million, these are these big steps. Okay. So like in Switzerland, I see that investors often look before 1 million revenue and after 1 million, for instance.
Okay. So before 1 million would then be a good timing for your first seed investment, probably?
No, after.
After, okay.
Milestone. If you get to a certain milestone, then you shop around with this milestone. Right. So if you crack the 1 million, then you can say, hey, you're already doing 1 million in revenue. What do you want? Yeah.
So basically, before 1 million, you do bootstrapping, or you ask family, friends, and fools if possible. Then as soon as you hit the 1 million, then you go for other investors like business angels, or maybe also first VC contacts.
I think it's really hard to only look at revenue. I would really go step by step. The best to show to an investor is EBITDA. If you're profitable, everybody wants to give you money, which is stupid in a way. So then the next best proxy is revenue. So then we can go for these steps. 500K is better than 100K. You just take as much as you can. If you don't have revenue growing, then you search for another KPI where you strive. If you have these growing users, or you just finish this awesome product, it's just the harder sale, because the investor is always money driven. So EBITDA, revenue, he understands or she understands very easily. If it goes into the product or traction and marketing stuff, most of them will have a bit more fear.
Then you probably also end up giving up more shares.
No. And this is something, maybe you have some questions also about this, but this is important, not to give away too many shares in one round.
Absolutely. I think this is closely linked to the valuation that you get. Tim Michaelis also asked, how can I estimate how much my startup is worth before starting the first financing round?
It's easy. You take a dime and then you no, it's really hard. And all the founders ask me, so what's a fair valuation? And I have a little bit special rule on how I do it. So I go back and ask the founder, how much money do you need for this next 1.5, 2 years? And depending on the amount he or she wants to raise, I then say, okay, we give away maybe 20% of the company, and then you end up at a certain valuation. And we just figured out that 20%, 20 to 25% is a healthy round, like shares to give away. So we aim for this stake as investors, and this gives you a rough idea where the valuation can be. What is not a good idea is to look to the US, to the UK, to Berlin, and ask for a similar startup, saying, hey, they raised at this valuation, but you'd never know the terms, etc. So it's really not a good idea to just compare to other companies in my eyes.
And have you also noticed any trends in terms of rising valuations here in Switzerland too, as they probably did in the US? Or is that a trend that is not in effect in Switzerland?
Yeah, it's going up. So all the founders, they read these blogs from the US and there are these fancy valuations. Obviously, they only talk about the top percent of the biggest rounds. So our Swiss founders, well, this is also good. They are proud and they think, my company is already 20 million or whatever, but it's dangerous. I would even say sometimes it's better to raise at a lower valuation because you already have to think about the next round. And the investors, and also you as a founder, you want to have a next round which is much higher than the last one. And what you want totally to avoid is a down round, because then it's really hard to convince new investors.
And what would you do in such a specific case if you actually get a down round for your company?
Then you need really good negotiation skills and showing your investors that it's just a phase and it's a turnaround situation, and then they can come into such a good company for a very decent price and it will rebound, and then you will have this very good upside in the next round then. But it takes a lot of negotiation to deal with the down round.
The next part that I would like to focus on with the user questions is basically the fundraising process. Helena asked, how can you get your foot in the door with a potential investor, and what's the approach there? Basically, how do you get in touch with investors?
Yeah, ideally you have a rich uncle or aunt. Most of us don't. I don't. Then you just, angel networks is a good idea. They're like group of people who want to invest in startups.
So, is there any network that you could recommend in particular?
Yeah, sure. All these Business Angels Switzerland, CICTIC for more technical cases, B2V in St. Gallen. All of these I would try to get a slot to have a speech in front of a big audience. And then if you're lucky, some of them will reach out to you and want to invest. And you can also go for VC money, but then most often you need a bit of to be a bit further with your company. Right. What I also do is cold calling. I would go, especially as we discussed a little bit earlier on, I would go for this skill set. What exactly do you need for a certain phase? And then go through LinkedIn or other platforms, look for these people who have this expertise in a certain area, and I would just try to get the email or phone number and call them up. And you will be surprised how many people often they are in their 50s or 60s, and most often, they don't have boring lives, but they like to talk to founders, and especially in their area. And they like to share their know-how, and if you're lucky, you even get an investor, or they know somebody who could invest in such a case. So I would hope that the Swiss founders lose the fear of cold contacting.
I mean, I think this is something that rarely gets done in Switzerland, this approach of finding investors. Yeah. What do you then actually tell them? I mean, for these like professionals with a close link to your company or to your professional area, you don't just go in there and say, hey, do you want to invest in my company?
Very good. No,
what do you tell them? How do you approach them?
Yeah, no, you go there and say, hey, let's call him Ben. Dear Ben, I found your profile and it's astonishing. You would be the perfect match to share some know-how. I want to learn from you. And then you are in. This is exactly the foot in the door. And then obviously Ben, at a certain stage, hopefully he understands that this is a great case, great founder, and he starts to invest. This is actually how I became a business angel. I didn't plan so, but the young founders came to me, asked for my advice, as I just mentioned. And then, if I'm smart, I invest in this case, because if I coach them a little bit, then my investment gives a good return. Of course.
And I think this also has a very nice psychological sort of part of it, because you ask them for input and you sort of put them as experts, and then they really want to help you, right?
Through 30 years, I gained this experience about a certain area, and now finally there is somebody who wants to disrupt this industry or comes with a new idea. and he asked for my know-how about this space. It's That's why it's actually very easy, but the Swiss founders don't do it enough, I think.
Are they just afraid, or what's the reason for that from your perspective?
It's not so nice. It's hard. It takes a lot of energy. Cold calling is just not fun. I had to do a lot for GetYourGuide. All the suppliers to call them up and bring them on a platform. It's just not nice. You have to explain who you are, why the internet is ready for you to sell tours, attractions. It's just tough, yeah.
Cedric Waldburger also asked if you don't have a network in Switzerland yet, is there anything that you would do differently in terms of that approach, or would that approach also work for someone who doesn't really have any network in Switzerland?
It's actually exactly for Cedric's question. So if you don't have a network, then I would do it with the business angel clubs. Right. The cold calling I would always do, because probably you end up with the better match if you do the cold calling part. Mm-hmm. Because at the business angel networks, obviously the ones in your space would probably be more likely to end up being your investor, but you're not sure. Right. So I would really encourage the Swiss founders to do the cold calling part.
I think this is a very good and strong message to take away. The next question comes from Maxim. He asks, how do I best present my business idea or my business plan? I think this can be closely linked to your presentation at a business angel network. What should you pay attention to right there? How do you present?
Yeah, what I learned is that they always prepare their presentation, their pitch deck, really nice. And now that's the problem, because most often your dream investor is not giving you 1 hour in his office and you can present. Yeah. Most likely you will end up at a very noisy event and you have exactly 30 seconds to tell your great business idea. So you have to really do the oral pitch a lot and train this and have this catchphrase so that most investors are interested into your case. If you only have 30 seconds, also if there is an event party, a very loud music, and you still can convince a person to give you more time to then listen closely. Sure. So I've really worked on this oral pitch, not only on the pitch presentation.
I know this is really hard, but maybe spontaneously you have a good pitch in mind that was delivered to you or that you did with GetYourGuide. What is like a good oral pitch?
So that's now the difficult part, because depending on the investor, you don't know what resonates with them. Right. So depending on the investor, you have to, with almost no data, you have to figure out what kind of person is sitting next to me, what could be a catchy phrase. So sometimes I said, we are already working with TripAdvisor, another big company, or somebody crazy cool is invested into our company, or like name dropping, this kind of stuff. But you have to try certain of these because you don't know which one will resonate. This is a skill you have to train. And for the first 10 times you will fail, but then suddenly you will become better also reading the other person and trying with the right catchphrase first.
And then once you successfully pitched it, you ask for a follow-up meeting or a phone call. What happens then?
So the only goal of this oral pitch is to get more time and in a not noisy space where you can then present your pixel perfect presentation, and you have 1 hour to convince the investor. And there I think energy level is something I would like to have. So I want to feel the passion and the energy of the founder team to being able to bring this great company alive.
And you mentioned the presentation. What should be in there? What do you present? I mean, there are good templates in the internet, but maybe you have a perfect structure that you think is
not
is
so
good
much. I just want to have it complete. So I want to have the team, the problem they solve, the solution, what's the offering. So like how much money they need, what do they do with it. So for me, it's standard, but sometimes there is one slide missing, and then I ask them, hey, can you give me a little bit more background about your traction in the market or things like that.
And then usually after such a presentation, there's also a discussion round. How does that work? Can you also walk us through the next step after the presentation?
It depends a lot on the investor. If you're more professional, then you enter due diligence, so they send you a Q&A with 30 to 1,000 questions, depending on the investor. If it's more private or business angels, they would just dig deeper in certain areas, I guess, doing it via phone call. What we like to do is to visit the founders. I always want to meet the entire founder team and maybe also key people. We like to visit the teams in their offices and get a little bit of feel of the culture.
What do you do if they are so early that they don't even have an office yet?
Doesn't matter. Then we go to a living room or where they live.
But just in their personal setting, that's basically where you wanna meet, right?
Yeah, I just look at small details, how they work. Are they very structured? Is there labels on the drawers, or is this total chaos? Both can work, but I just want to get a feel at how they operate.
And then after you had the Q&A session or the follow-up questions, what happens then at a certain point? You probably also negotiate, right?
Well, yeah, that's and don't do this too early. Often founders try to already negotiate valuations, etc. But normally, as a founder, you should just convince the business angel or investor with as many positive phrases as possible. So you highlight what is so cool about your company, and in the end, when the investor is really tempted, then you start a little bit to go into term sheet, and a good way for the founder is to deliver the term sheet and not to wait for a term sheet, because obviously if you as a founder start with a term sheet, it's more founder friendly than if the investor does the first draw.
Very smart advice, I would say. Do you think that founders need any template for that, or should they go to a legal advisor, or how should they actually create the term sheet? What's your best practice there?
I would always go to a lawyer, and I would go to a lawyer who really worked with startups, because every lawyer would tell you startups, I've done many, but you have to work with a lawyer who did growth startups and did this many times. Otherwise you end up in a mess. I saw that several times. So I would go to a law firm. It's well worth to spend up to 5,000 francs for a Series A, I would say.
Is there any good law firm that you could recommend here in Switzerland?
Yeah, in Zurich there are a couple, but it's easy to find out. Okay. I would just go and look for the companies who raised money, and most often you find whom they worked with.
Case studies or anything, yeah, exactly. And then after the term sheet, what happens then? The term sheet is basically also, sort of like a letter of intent, right? But you haven't actually purchased or signed any shares yet. So how do you then proceed after that?
Yeah, and I just spoke to a lawyer, and he said he saw many deals. He said he never saw a big change from the non-binding term sheet to the actual shareholders agreement. So you never should celebrate before you have the money on the account, obviously. But if you negotiated the term sheet, then most likely you end up with a decent shareholders agreement also. Then the lawyers draft the shareholders agreement, and then you sign it, they wire the money, and then you go for celebration.
Then you go to work.
Then you go to work.
And then also Cedric Waldberger asked, what are the key terms on a term sheet? First of all, what key terms are there that you should look out for? And second, what do they actually mean, so that you also get the real meaning or the purpose of these terms?
As mentioned, I would really start with the standard template of one of these beautiful law firms, as we just discussed. Then one of the caveats is liquidation preference, for instance. I think it's okay. Also, as a founder, I always thought if somebody gives me $1 million and I mess up or doesn't work so well, I would give this $1 million back, and the rest is split between all of us. I think it's sort of fair. What I would not accept is if liquidation preference is more than one multiple. So 1 million in, 1 million back is okay. 1 million in, first you give me 2 million back, I would never accept. Right. This is something I don't like. Then tag along, drag along, but this is all standard. Board matters maybe. So who is in the board? Normally the lead investor or the one with the biggest ticket wants to have a board seat. Often you want this. If you did the cold calling well, if you have this perfect person as a new investor, then you want him or her in the board.
Quick question there. Usually this is linked to the person with the highest shares or the highest investment amount. But as you said, it could also be probably the person that adds smart money and doesn't necessarily have to be the largest shareholder.
Absolutely.
Who would you choose then?
Always the smartest person, and not only smartest with the know-how for this next phase. But one important topic is does this person have time? Right. So I have seen really cool people, CEOs of big companies. They don't have time. They don't even show up for the board meeting. Sure. So then that's not a good fit. So I would not go for the largest ticket. Most often the one with the largest ticket is also totally fine if somebody else who really can work in this next phase or help in this next phase is in the board. Most often they accept it or foster it even. Right.
And other terms that you should look out for as a founder?
Board matters, I always think. So we discussed board, and then there is often a section like what do you have to discuss or ask all the shareholders? What do you have to ask your board? And which decisions can the management take? And there sometimes I see if you have to, for every spending of 5,000 if you always have to ask your shareholders or your board, it's just tedious. So these board matters I would have a close look, like which kind of actions do you have to vote in the board? What can the management do by themselves?
Absolutely. And also one thing that you usually put into these shareholder agreements are bad and good leaver clauses in vesting for the founders. Yeah. What is your best practice there?
So vesting for the founders is key. At GetYourGuide we were extremely strict. If you would leave within the first 3 years, we would have to hand the shares back to the company.
All of it?
All of it.
Wow.
We just were extremely strict. We had the idea that only if we work for the company, then we can add value to the company. Sure. So that was a little bit our understanding. Obviously, if a founder works for 3, 4, 5 years for a company, he or she should take some shares with him or her. But investors don't like founder shares lying around, not working for the company. So you also send a message. So that's why I always think if a founder leaves the company, he or she should give back a big chunk of the shares.
Would you recommend to do the 3-year period? Because what is more common is usually that you have a 1-year cliff, and after that your shares start vesting on a monthly or annual basis, basically.
Yeah, for employees this is perfect. What you will learn as a founder in every new round, the new investor says, good vesting scheme. I have here the new vesting scheme. So you will be vesting and revesting all the time. So whatever you discuss and is good for a certain round, you have to negotiate this again 1.5 years later when you do the next round.
And then you probably end up at the 3 years anyway.
Yeah. So it's always prolonging. So at Series E even, the investor want to have them motivated and staying in the company. So there will be a vesting again. Obviously not for the total amount, but there will be always a vesting.
One question that came from Eingefleischt through Instagram was, how do you cope with uncertainty? Because this is a constant sort of part of the whole fundraising process from the investor's perspective, but also from the founder's perspective, right? So are there any good recommendations from your side how you can deal with this uncertainty?
Yeah, for me, this is the fun part of the whole thing. That's exactly why I like doing it, because it's not so easy. And sometimes you just have to take a decision out of your stomach and trust the people or whatever. Right. If you can't deal with uncertainty, then you're not a startup investor. Then I just wouldn't do it. You can't sleep anymore.
Right. And from a founder's perspective?
Same thing. It's really hard. If you can't deal with uncertainty, it's probably not a good idea to run a company, because it's always tough. You have always more problems than solutions. And if you can't deal with it, then maybe it's a good advice to join a company which is already a bit bigger.
Now, assume you have closed your funding round, you successfully raised the funds, and now you also sort of have investors on board and you collaborate or work with them. How does this working relationship look like with your investors? I know there are like reportings that you usually send out, but maybe you can also give us a bit more insights here, what a good founder and investor working relationship looks like beyond the smart money approach that you already mentioned.
Yeah, it's depending on how much these investors want to work with the company. Obviously, if they work more, the better. What I usually recommend is a monthly reporting. And based on this report, there should always be a section where you can help. So if you look for a CMO, for instance, then you put this as a action title for your investors, saying, hey, by the way, we are looking for this and this profile. If you happen to know anybody, reach out to us. So these are ideas on how to get them motivated to work. Yes. Because as an investor, you only start working if something happens or if the founders calls you up. So I would do the monthly reporting, so they are a little bit aware what's going on, and then it's easier to ask them for help. And if you happen to have a good investor on the board, then you call them up whenever there is something happening or just a second opinion. So I like this the most. If the CEOs just call me up saying, hey, this happened to this employee, is it okay if I fire him? Then we discuss shortly, and most often it's okay to fire him.
But this would only happen if you're sitting on the board, right? Or also if you're just a regular investor?
It doesn't have to. You can choose whomever. Obviously, in the whole regulatory section of your company, the board has more information rights than others, so you have to be a little bit careful. Most often, this person would sit in the board.
And the board meetings, how often would you recommend to have them? Once a month, once every quarter, once a year? What is the best practice from your perspective there?
I would do once a quarter, maybe one extra for budgeting, so 4 to 5. Okay. Yeah, if it's more, then it's extremely a lot of work. For also on the investor side, probably they are invested in different companies. Right. Then it's a lot of meetings. Yeah.
And could also result in sort of an overkill. Yeah. Would you also suggest to do any additional meetings with investors beyond that? Because you have the board meetings, you have the monthly reporting. Would you recommend to, for example, host, a drinks or a dinner once a year with your investors or anything like that to establish this good relationship?
That's an extremely good point. And most of the Swiss founders, especially, they don't do it well. It's a shareholders relationship. So in certain cases, you invest, let's say 100K, and then 1.5 years later, you get a call or an email saying, hey, thank you for being our shareholder. Now we need more money. This is ridiculous. So it's very, very good to do every half a year or a year a get-together. If there is a certain topic you want to discuss with one of the shareholders because he or she has experience, then even better to do a lunch or whatever. Keep them in the loop a little bit. So the update every month also helps. But some people don't read emails, so it's really good to keep them motivated, tell them what's going on. Yes. And you can avoid a lot of problems when you have your general assembly, and you then tell them, hey, actually growth is not working as we expected. So if you already brief them, then you have a much more relaxed meeting afterwards.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for all the recommendations and the tips. I think they were incredibly valuable and helpful for people listening to this.
Let's hope.
Is there anything that you would like to add that we have not discussed yet about the fundraising at an early stage topic?
Maybe just the fact I can't stress enough to choose your investor wisely. So it's a little bit like a marriage. You are in. You can't get them out easily. Right. It's almost impossible to get them out. Mm-hmm. So, and every shareholder can be annoying. Because if they call you, most probably you want to answer. And if they start calling you every second day and start to micromanaging, then you have a problem. So if it's chemically not working well with a certain person, I would try not to take them in as a shareholder. Sometimes you have to right. Take the money, but choose your investor wisely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Pascal. It was a pleasure having you here, and I wish you all the best with Wingman. You do some really awesome stuff, and I look forward to hearing all the news about your next ventures.
Thank you. It was cool.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If the content was helpful to you, we would appreciate your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Next week, we are back in Silicon Valley and meet Marcus Akamus. Marcus co-founded Students.ch and the Fashion Days Group. Today, he is active as an investor and lives in San Francisco. His story is not only inspiring, but also full of great learnings and stories. An episode that you definitely don't want to miss. So make sure to tune in to an all new episode of the Swisspreneur Show next week.